Back, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at our latest updates from the ongoing summit between President Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Well, US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have arrived in Alaska. Trump has met Putin on the stairs of his plane before the two headed to their meeting.
Today, but I'm not going to be happy if it's not today. Everyone said it can't be today, but I'm just saying I want the killing to stop. I'm in this.
Well, US President on board the Air Force One said he does not know what is going to happen today, but he is not going to be happy if a deal isn't done. Well, ahead of the Alaska meeting, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky once again reiterated his wish to hold a three-way summit. He said there were no signals from Russia to stop the war and said that Russia continued attacking Ukraine ahead of the summit. Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev has expressed hope for the restoration of Russia-US relations and not just the economy. Russian President's special envoy called the mood ahead of the Putin-Trump talks as combative. Kirill is part of the Russian delegation, which will be part of the Putin-Trump talks. The Kremlin has agreed to a conditional three-way meeting if the Alaska talks bear results, expressing hope the talks between the two leaders will bring a solution. Meanwhile, the Kremlin expects the talks between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to go on for between 6 to 7 hours. Putin is accompanied by his 5-member delegation, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Trump has with him a team of 7, led by Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And Russian President Vladimir Putin made a brief pit stop in Magadan in Russia while on his way to Alaska. The Russian president offered flowers at a World War II memorial to commemorate the US-Soviet cooperation. Well, we start as President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin have met on the tarmac in Anchorage ahead of their highly anticipated summit. Now, according to reports, the meeting has begun. Trump, wearing his signature red tie, stood on a red carpet at the military base as Putin arrived. The two leaders shook hands firmly, walked side by side to cheers from the crowd, and stood on a riser marked Alaska 2025. Trump briefly saluted as US military aircraft flew overhead, while both men ignored questions from reporters. Putin, in a dark suit, gestured that he could not hear the shouted queries. The meeting now moves behind closed doors for hours of critical talks on Ukraine and bilateral relations. Well, of course, the images we are showing you now from that initial meeting on the tarmac in Alaska, Anchorage, both world leaders taking the steps down from their aircraft at the same time, seemingly choreographed, and of course a moment of pivotal importance. Joining us first to discuss this meeting and its implications, Adrian Calamel, an international terror scholar, joining us live from New York. Adrian, as always, a pleasure to be speaking with you and to have you on the programme. Let's look at this meeting, this initial coming together of presidents from Russia and Ukraine. A warm-ish embrace, both men standing tall, smiling, shaking hands. This, of course, in contrast to the initial moments of discussion between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House. Of course, extremely different. What does this say about the relationship between Trump and Putin?
Well, thank you for having me, Joshua. I think the relationship between Trump and Putin has clearly been Trump, to a certain degree, trusts Putin, but I do believe that his patience is wearing thin, because what he, when Trump came to office, he wanted to, and this is outlandish, to have a ceasefire deal and a truce and peace with this conflict. That was never going to happen. But there's been offers on the table, and what we've seen is more, a continued aggression by Russia, by Putin, and I think there is that contrast, and it's I think rather shameful on the side of our president when the way he traded Vladimir Zelensky. That's, if you're going to have those type of discussions that are combative, you do that behind closed doors. You don't do that in the Oval Office in front of everybody. So there's been problems with the negotiating from the very beginning, and I think Trump has ceded any type of leverage that he would have ever had in the conversation by painting Zelensky as the bad guy, Ukraine as the bad actors, and as Russia and Putin as this benign actor that has only baloney sliced its way through Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine once, Ukraine again. I mean, where does it stop? But Trump seems to think that he can get deals done, and maybe it's just because he's a powerful individual.
Yes, and Adrian, of course, this meeting between the leaders of the United States and the leaders of Russia coming amidst tension globally, not just surrounding, of course, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also questions to be raised about economic action, threats from the US on Russia, and secondary tariffs being implemented now for countries that have purchased Russian oil. How significant are the bilateral talks that are set to take place, not just on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but on a whole host of other issues?
Those are very important. I really think that those threats of the 50% tariffs are really what kind of brought Putin back to the table, would be my estimation in my looking at this. Those are important conversations to have. I wish Trump hadn't gone and threatened, let's say, our peers, countries such as India with 50% tariffs. I wish there was another way to work around this. There are ways to work around this, but he went after some of our strategic allies with this threat, and that would have hurt Russia significantly. And one of the things that we'll hear from other people, that Russia has all the leverage. You know what? Their economy is not what they're selling barrels of oil at half the price. Okay, they have a firepower issue in the Ukraine that's been going on for a while now. It's further been diminished because of U.S. and Israeli operations against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they also have a manpower issue in the conflict when they're pulling in North Korean troops. So, the United States has, and Trump has ceded this leverage that we do have over Russia. I think that a move should be made for a favorable outcome towards the Ukrainian side, where some type of reparations are paid. But I think the end game will be Russia will keep Crimea. They'll hold on to the majority of the Donbass region, and there will be no NATO membership on the table for Ukraine.
Adrian, please do stay with us. We're also going to welcome Gilbert Doctorow, a Russian affairs expert, to join us live on the programme from Brussels. Gilbert, thank you for your time. Of course, this meeting taking place with two of three key stakeholders in this conflict, the US putting themselves front and centre, of course, of talks, but the Ukrainian leader not present. With discussions set to take place about potentially ending this conflict, how significant is that when Volodymyr Zelensky could just turn around and say no?
Well, I don't think he'll have an option of saying no and staying in power. The issues that are before us today are very difficult to give a knowledgeable and confident answer. Will this succeed? Will this not succeed? I frankly, personally, I'm on the knife's edge on this issue. I was watching the Russian news coverage, Russian state television news coverage, which is very optimistic, which was glowing over the reception that Mr. Putin received at the airport by his going away in the car of Donald Trump, two of them together. That sounded wonderful, and the Russian journalists were beaming. However, what they didn't mention, and what was covered up, for example, in the BBC's broadcast of that reception at the airport, were the shouts, so-called questions from reporters. There was one lady, and she was not asking questions. She was making accusations. The last of her three questions was, question, so to speak, was, Mr. Putin, when will you stop killing civilians? If you don't mind my saying, that's not a question. And that she was allowed, in the presence of Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump, to deliver such questions is not a good start to this meeting. So I remain unpersuaded that this will succeed. And if it doesn't succeed, it will be disastrous in the consequences for Ukraine and for global relations. But I see such a possibility that the Americans are turning on their head all the suppositions that we've heard in major media, that Mr. Trump would be manipulated by the very shrewd Mr. Putin and so forth. I see a different eventuality, unfortunately, that the hubris of the American advisors remains unrestrained, and that they believe that they can entrap Mr. Putin by holding out all of these goodies, by holding out the prospect of the negotiations proceeding in parallel on improving commercial relations and whatever else can be done by having the American Secretary of Commerce present. It's quite possible this is all a big trick.
Okay, Gilbert, let's look at that optimism that you're saying was coming from Russian state television. Of course, that can be expected. Vladimir Putin has got a meeting with Donald Trump. He is putting himself alongside Donald Trump. And of course, conversations are not including Ukraine and aren't including Ukraine's Western European allies. Do you think the fact that the European nations that support Ukraine, the coalition of the willing and Ukraine themselves are not at this meeting, is this showing potentially that they are set to be sidelined moving forward, and it will just be the US and Russia who decide how this peace deal looks?
I take issue with your mention of the European leaders as supporting Ukraine. They are destroying Ukraine. They are not supporting Ukraine. They are warmongers who are seeking to perpetuate this war, which is only costing thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives of Ukrainian soldiers. So the game is a little bit different from the way you presented it. And it is going very badly for Ukraine. Although if you listen to major Western media like the BBC, like CNN, as I just did, you'd never know that. They're speaking about Russians losing 30,000 men a month. They're speaking about the Russian economy fading. It's rubbish. It's total propaganda. And that, unfortunately, is widespread through almost all Western media. Therefore, you have the hubris and the expectation that Mr. Trump can manipulate Mr. Putin. That, if that is what's going to happen in the next several hours, is a disastrous mistake and a misreading of the real situation.
Well, Gilbert, thank you for that insight. Of course, Western leaders have spoken about the risk that Russia may pose to Europe, and they have said that they are supporting Ukraine for the security of Europe. But let's now move to Karis Rea, who is an American journalist joining us live from Washington, D.C. Karis, thank you ever so much for your time. Donald Trump, coming into these talks, has said that within minutes he will know whether Vladimir Putin actually wants to progress peace. He also said that if these talks don't seem to move forward in the time in which they're taking place, which is currently now, he is willing to walk away from them. Do you think Donald Trump would follow through with that?
I hope he would follow through. He might be hearkening back to, I believe, 1984 when President Reagan, I think he ended up walking out of a meeting with Gorbachev in Reykjavik, and that ended up proving to be a very, very good move. That, you know, Gorbachev was essentially testing the resolve of Reagan, and Trump's approach seems to be the same. And in 1984, I think that led to some sort of huge compromise with the nuclear talks because the talks fell apart last minute as a result of Reagan's resolve. So hopefully he won't have to walk away. I mean, Trump's already threatening economic sanctions, so Putin is in a very difficult position. The EU tariff agreement is a huge blow to Russia because he's got one thing to sell, and that is natural gas. That Putin only has natural gas for Russia to depend on, and Putin's been able to avoid, any sanctions precisely because Europe has agreed to buy from him. But now with this enormous supply of energy that the EU agreed to buy from America, it's a great threat to Putin. And as was it Adrian said, his other market is basically China, which he's selling at an unbelievable discount. China has basically whittled him down to the bone, his profits. So he needs to sell to the West, and he's under tremendous stress economically. I mean, whether the numbers of, up to 1 million soldiers dying, Russian soldiers dying, are true or not, there are other factors than the wear and tear of the Russian military to consider, and I think the economy is a big one. So I actually think that Trump holds a lot of leverage here.
Yes, and Kara, staying with you, Trump holding leverage, of course, is something that we've seen throughout these diplomatic discussions, direct talks between US delegates, Russian delegates, also direct talks between US delegates and Ukrainian delegates. Donald Trump has put himself front and centre, saying that this war would be ended within days. If this doesn't turn into progress towards a deal, is this a defeat for Trump personally?
I don't think so. I mean, yes, it's true. Trump has a big ego, but we see this kind of grandiose language, rhetoric that he uses. He used the same thing. He used the same kind of language when it came to Hamas and Gaza on day one. He'll get a deal. I don't think Trump is fazed much by real world events not supporting his own rhetoric. I think Trump will move on. He's a very transactional, practical guy, and I think I think he has a very sobering analysis of what is going on going into the, because, as your other guest mentioned, he has essentially been dealing with Putin since February, and Putin has just been giving him the runaround, and Trump is kind of at his wit's end. He kind of understands how this seasoned KGB agent operates now, and his rhetorical games that he likes to play in order to serve his own interests. So I have faith that Trump has his head on going to these negotiations, and I hope that he can't be swayed with any sort of bluster or verbose historical revisionism that Putin might put in front of him, as he's done with Western ignorant podcasters like Tucker Carlson or Scott Horton.
Yes, Gilbert, coming back to you, what does Vladimir Putin want out of this meeting, and what does he want in the war with Ukraine?
I think you lost Gilbert.
Well, I believe we have. Adrian, let me pose that question to you then.
What does Putin want? Putin, he's going to want the best terms he can possibly get. He's going to continue to press. I mean, you look, here's the big problem with this. You see this, just these, no Ukraine involved, no Zelensky involved. It's just Putin and Trump. And this, it harkens back to the Doha Agreement, where you just have the United States and Taliban representatives. You don't have representatives from the Afghan government. You don't have anything like that. You have the Taliban, the enemy, agreeing to something with the Trump administration. What did they do? They waited out the Trump administration and then unleashed a full onslaught. And then the next administration coming in didn't have the political will to hold the Taliban to account for the violations in the Doha Agreement. So Putin's going to, as Kara said, he's a seasoned KGB agent, and his way of looking at foreign policy is it's very I used the term baloney slicing before. It's very Bismarckian, or almost like what Hitler did until Poland became a stretch, a bridge too far, and then the rest of the world jumped in. What's going to stop this guy? I don't see deterrence coming out of this, and that's the major issue. And what Putin's winning on this because what he's going to get is he's going to get no NATO membership. That's one big thing that he's always wanted. He wanted to make sure that Ukraine never joined NATO, and he's going to get that. He's eventually going to get that, and Trump's basically agreed to that as well. You know, he wants to move out of the isolation. He's isolated. He wants to. He's got economic problems, despite what Gilbert may have said. He's in a bind right now. This has dragged on way too long. And despite what other people say, yes, he does have a manpower issue in the Ukraine. He does have an economic problem. He needs to come to some type of resolution. But he wants, as I said, a favorable outcome where he feels like he's getting one over on us, on Zelensky, on everybody. That's the way he works. Or it's a tactical retreat for a little bit until he makes the move during another administration.
Let's, Adrian, build on a point that you made that was, of course, deterrence, tariffs, sanctions, secondary sanctions, all buzzwords that have been used by the Trump administration looking to put pressure on Russia. Do you think that's a realistic outcome at the end of today when these talks are finalised and the situation is clearer?
Yeah, we'll see what happens with that if we do see these secondary tariffs. As I said before, I do believe that's what brought him to the table. But I think a big part of Trump's policy since he came in with the Russia and Ukraine conflict is really to take the kinetic action off the table. It's just going to be through putting you in an economic vice and using that, turning up the aperture when you start to get out of hand, or turning it down if you start to, and financial inducements to get you to stop fighting, stop committing, stop invading countries. So I think that's kind of where we are to answer that question.
Karis, coming to you next. We have often seen Donald Trump's rhetoric on this conflict ebbing and flowing, flipping and flopping. It sometimes seems that his comments on the conflict depend on who he's spoken to last. Do you think we could see that here again today?
I think it's more important actually to look at Trump's actions. I think like most issues, Trump has actually been pretty consistent. I mean, contrary to people thinking that Trump is, some Russian, colluded with Russia, or that he has been cozying up to Putin, or that they are best friends. Actually, in his first term, Trump imposed some of the harshest sanctions on Russia than any president, certainly harsher than Obama. And it's true that he's taken a tough line with Zelensky, as he should, given that Zelensky came to America and essentially endorsed Trump's rival candidate for president, which is absolutely insane, especially given that Trump supplied Ukraine during his first term with the very, with the only offensive weaponry that they got. They didn't really get any good artillery from Biden. I hope that answered your question. I agree that I think that Trump really seems to be motivated more here with like ending human suffering and a loss of life, the kinetic activity on the ground. And, I think that Trump actually knows what he's doing in this. And I don't think that Putin has a lot of great options here. And the question is, what kind of agreement is Trump going to craft, right? Is he going to allow Putin to keep the, eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region? Some people argue that that is unacceptable. Other analysts say that, that we should cede that territory to Russia. But I think that Trump has actually shown a willingness since those disastrous talks with Zelensky to be tougher with Putin and more supportive of Ukraine. He has talked about rearming Ukraine. He has said Ukraine is, we recognize Ukraine's independence. So I do not think that this is, that these these two people are coming in this, as chums and, on the same side. I think Trump is very clear about who Putin is.
Adrian, I want to pose a similar question to you, but look at it from a different perspective. Certain speakers and experts have questioned whether Donald Trump has done enough to put the pressure on Vladimir Putin. Deadlines put in place relating to sanctions. So far, only India receiving secondary sanctions for the purchase of Russian oil. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on this are that Trump came into this administration, came into this presidency with two hot wars that he had to deal with. One in the Middle East, which was really hot, and then one in the Ukraine that's been grinding on. But the Middle East was, it was embroiling, and it got larger and larger until, eventually, Trump was very decisive with his actions with the Islamic Republic and their nuclear program. So with his, I would hope that he, with Russia, with Putin, I don't think it's been an unwillingness to deal with it. There's just been so much going on foreign policy wise. If you look at conflicts from around the world, that he kind of put that in a placeholder and said, let's get this moving here. I think I can deal with Putin to a certain degree, and I think we can come to some type of resolution. But at least let's start initiating the talks and see what happens, and start turning up the pressure, and see what with every push or cause, there's going to be a reaction, and see what the reaction is going to be. And unfortunately lately, and what's been rightly pointed out, is that I think Trump's just he's losing his patience with Putin, and I think that's kind of where we are right now. I think Trump wants to get something done right now, but he's not afraid to walk away from this and put more pressure on Putin and Russia, and that's going to come in the form of financial pressure. And unfortunately, that could hit India. What we should be doing is making sure that we're, if we're looking at sanctions, Trump is being very lax with the Islamic Republic of Iran's oil being shipped to Iran. Why isn't he taking a stronger stance on that? So one of my big criticisms is that if you look at China, Russia, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, they triangulate their foreign policy against us. And I think Trump has a tendency to kind of compartmentalize these issues when you got to kind of look at them as if they're all kind of working against us.
Yes, also joining us to discuss this summit, David K. Johnston, an American author. Thank you ever so much, David, for taking the time to speak with us. Both Russia and the US have spoken about another talk, a trilateral, including Ukrainian delegation. Do you think that this will be the next step? And how important is it that Ukraine are at the table, given that they are one half of this war that is ongoing?
Well, nothing's going to happen without getting the Ukrainian leadership to agree to this. Vladimir Putin, in the statements from the Kremlin before this meeting, showed that he hasn't budged one bit. In fact, you can read one of his statements to suggest he wants even more territory turned over to him. And Zelensky has been very clear that that's not going to happen. There's also very good indications that this meeting in Alaska, a strange place to meet because it suggests government boundaries can change, Alaska having once been Russian territory, is much more about commercial transactions. Look at the people the Russians have announced are in the party. It doesn't include the people you might expect if you were focused first and foremost on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it has a lot of people with commercial interests because, of course, Vladimir Putin knows that if he can say to Donald Trump, well, we're going to give you billions of dollars, we're going to invest money on behalf of you, that's music to Donald's ears.
Yes, and Karis, coming back to you, Of course, this is something that has been discussed throughout the evening, but I'd like your perspective on it. A red line for Ukraine is not conceding land. That is something that has been discussed, of course, by Russia, but also President Trump leading up to this meeting. Do you think that's the only way a compromise could be found? And how might Ukraine respond?
I have to just tell you, I'm pretty bad with speculation. Whenever I predict things that will happen, I would say 50% of the time they don't go that way. So I have no idea what Ukraine will do, but I have confidence that one thing that will not happen is Trump agreeing to cede more territory other than the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. I think that I cannot imagine that could ever be on the table for Trump and Rubio and Witkoff. So I think it really just comes down to that region. And I believe my sense is that Trump is going to be arguing from a position of not ceding any territory, of getting that territory back to Ukraine, because if we've looked in the past at Trump's negotiating rhetoric, he always starts at 100%. I mean, look at how he wields tariffs, right? Not just as a mechanism of trade, but to deal with other elements, other policy arenas. And so, Trump will, I think he's going to start very, very, very firm with Russia, and then we'll see what happens. So that's my hunch. I don't know what could be gained with Zelensky and Putin there. I understand, Adrian, that you believe that that's a very important part of these negotiations for Zelensky to be there. But I mean, as we've seen, in the past in the Oval Office with how Zelensky related to Trump, which is, an administration that has been, essentially the backbone of Zelensky's survival in this. I mean, Europe has not done one thing for Ukraine. They have not sent any troops. They've been buying more, fuel from Russia, that Putin can use to fund his artillery. So I don't think that, I think that Zelensky in these talks might be more of a liability, just in terms of like his posturing and, the Ukrainian/Polish national pride that we tend to see in this type of region. And it might be better for Trump to communicate with Zelensky, after the fact. So we'll see what happens. Everything's up in the air.
Yes, absolutely. Also joining us, Walter Anderson, a political analyst, joining us live from Washington, D.C. Walter, thank you ever so much for your time. Can I just get your first initial reactions to your opinions of this greeting between President Trump and President Putin, but also how you expect these discussions to go?
Just finished a 2-hour thing in a competitive network of yours regarding this whole issue, where there were people, representing the EU feeling. And one thing that came out, and it has a relationship to this and to pressure on Trump, is that the EU is now more united than NATO than it has been probably for decades now, and the Russians have done it. 2 states have joined it: Finland, which is terribly anti-Russian, the Baltic states are in there, and Sweden. So you have a much strong, and the EU and the NATO states in the Europe have agreed to go from 2 to 5%. Half of them have already done so. So I think they're going to be putting pressure on our country and on Trump to do something. Then if you look at the press today, I read the Washington Post and New York Times this morning just to get a sense of what Americans are thinking, some of the quote-unquote elites. It is almost without every article, I would say, I can't think of an exception that wasn't telling Trump he has to be tough with Putin. Everyone was saying that. And my colleagues at Johns Hopkins University are equally tough on that. And Dr. Johnson, I'm not sure where you teach, but I'm sure your colleagues, probably too. There's a lot of sentiment, there's pro-Ukrainian sentiment. In the neighborhood of the Washington suburb I live in, there are flags of Ukraine all over the place. That just goes to show you how it's hitting the popular mood. And the contacts at the previous meeting I was saying said popular opinion in Europe is also moving in a direction, a more united direction against what the Russians are doing, fearing that they could be in a situation similar to what Europe in the 1930s when the European states did not unite to oppose Hitler. And the sense is that and somebody quoted from an article in which they're using that very analogy that the states have to unite to prevent the Russians from getting too strong. And that is also a theme in the American newspapers as well. In fact, I'm looking at one here. Is that it says that. Can the U.S.-India relationship be saved is the title of it. And it goes into the problems of the U.S.-Indian relationship because of the U.S. getting tough on Russia, one of which, of course, is to increase tariffs on countries that continue to buy oil, as does India. And I'm not sure you want to get into that, but that's an interesting question all in of itself.
Absolutely.
But I think there is a move in the direction of popular opinion in the EU, apparently, if what I'm told is true, and certainly in the U.S. As well. A sentiment that's favorable, and it's growing more favorable toward the Ukraine. And polls tend to show that. I just saw a poll yesterday. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal that the American public opinion is strongly in favor of Ukraine. It's a little more divided on whether the U.S. should get involved and whether there are troops there. I myself have some issues about whether there should be troops or not. Much depends on all of that about what Putin does. I think Putin is smart enough to know that there are two things I think that Trump wants from this meeting. One is to get some indication that Putin at least is thinking of the possibility of a ceasefire. I think Putin is smart enough to know he's got to say something because he's not committing himself. This is a pre-summit. This is not the summit. The summit will come when you have Zelensky get involved.
Walter, let's build on that. Apologies to interject. I want to build on that specific point. And David, I'm going to come to you with this question because it is the billion-dollar question if you're looking at funds that have been transferred from the US and other nations towards Ukraine. What happens next? This is the precursor to a potential three-way summit involving Ukraine. But let's look at the facts. There are Russian demands, there are Ukrainian demands. They completely contradict each other, and both countries say they're not going to move. So how does Donald Trump unlock that?
Oh, Donald doesn't have any magical powers here. I've negotiated with Donald many times over the last 37 years, and I've always walked away with everything I wanted because he's a terrible negotiator, and I've written about this, plenty of articles pointing that out. The Europeans, contrary to what one of the other guests said, have actually put more money into defending Ukraine than we have. Donald claims $350 billion. It's actually $120 billion, a third of that. But that's standard Donald to just make up numbers and lie. The Europeans have now, as Walter Anderson pointed out, recognizing the danger here because of the recalcitrance of Putin, who is the aggressor. And I have, by marriage, family, people who lived behind the old Iron Curtain. I've been to Europe and interviewed a lot of people, and it is a widely held belief among government leaders of the countries closest to Russia, the Baltic republics, Slovakia, Moldova, for example, that if they don't stop Putin and make him back out of the Ukrainian territory he's seized by force, it's just a matter of time for the Russians to rebuild their army, and the tanks will roll into Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia and other countries. Putin is on record for more than 25 years about his belief that the countries controlled by the Kremlin all need to be put back together under the Kremlin's, I would say, boot. He would say their grace. What's going to happen next is nothing significant. Trump will he will come away from this meeting with something that's been fed to him by Putin. But Donald is appallingly ignorant. It's incredibly important to understand. Donald doesn't know anything. He didn't know what happened on December 7th, 1941, when he was in his first term. He has no idea that 1,000 years ago, Kyiv was a thriving city and Moscow was two huts in the forest. He knows nothing of the history of these things. If you mention to him that the old Soviet always referred to the Ukraine, and would he know the significance of that? No, he wouldn't have a clue. And by the way, Walter, I teach at Rochester Institute of Technology. I teach law, criminal justice, public policy, and journalism.
Adrian, I'll come with you.
you.
Thank you, David, for that insight. Adrian, we've just played a graphic showing the two top teams, Team Trump, Team Putin, and who is accompanying the two presidents in these discussions. Who, in your opinion, has the stronger team, and who do you think is more likely to get what they want out of this summit?
Oof, that's a tough question. Well, if I look, I mean, there's the big players are there. You know, Lavrov's there. On the United States side, I would say that in this instance, when we're talking about Ukraine, Rubio probably has the most pull, the most understanding, and the one that truly understands this conflict. Steve Witkoff, he's a failed real estate agent, and I don't think he's a really serious person. So I think Trump needs to, and Rubio's juggling many balls right now within the administration. Rubio is the guy to look for, I think, as far as serious foreign policy. He's going to be the one talking to Trump and advising him closely. On the Russian side, you know, there's a series of economic individuals there because the Russians feel as though they're in an economic vice. But it's also, you know, Putin's usual cronies. So the U.S. is a good team with them if they listen to Rubio and sideline Witkoff, I would say.
Well, yes, Adrian, the reason I wanted to put that question towards you was for the follow-up, because ultimately we know that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin often get what they want. I wanted to see and want to find out from you if you think there might be any challenge to that. Of course, Lavrov, the most senior diplomat in Putin's team, has been by his side for 20 years. Rubio coming from a different point of view, but definitely the most senior politician in that group. Is this purely just Trump gets what he wants, Putin gets what he wants, and ultimately it's the two heads coming together? Or could there be some influence from the other players?
Are you talking about the meeting? Are you talking about the meeting today?
I'm talking to Adrian once again. Apologies, David. Or Walter.
You're exactly right. That relationship with Lavrov and Putin goes back a very long way. And if we look at the relationship between Rubio and Trump, it was very strained when you look at when Trump ran for president in his first presidential campaign. Rubio was one of the potential frontrunners, and then eventually became through his support. I think over time, what we're seeing is Trump is realizing that Rubio is the person to go to on foreign policy. Trump changed his complete position in 2016, or in the debates leading up to the in the Republican primaries, because about the Iranian nuclear program, because Marco Rubio rightly pointed out the threat that the Islamic Republic presented to them. And Rubio ran an attack ad saying, you know, and all of a sudden, Trump changed his tune the very next day. And next debate, he was talking about the Islamic Republic, their nuclear program, the threat they pose to the region. So I think he's starting to realize that Marco Rubio probably is the smartest guy in the room, in my estimation. But again, it's a relationship that's had, you know, it's had some bumps along the way. And Trump has a history of, you know, people don't last in his administrations, but it's not like Russia where you're limited to 8, you know, in the United States, you're limited to 8 years. Russia, you can name somebody to be president for 2 terms and then come back and be president when you want to be. And that's exactly what he did with Medvedev. So.
Yes. Karis, I'd like to come to you next. Do you think that both Trump and Putin will come out of this summit both feeling like they've won? And publicly, if there is some unity there, how does this impact talks with Ukraine?
Well, I don't know what's in these men's hearts and minds, but I think whatever happens, Trump will surely come out of it saying that he's won. We know Trump likes to win, and you know, I don't really think it matters. I think it matters, you know, what actual deal is crafted. And if Putin is so uncompromising as to, return the Donbas region and cede territory back to Ukraine, then hopefully Trump will be smart enough to secure some sort of security guarantee for Ukraine, right? Because Ukraine, we all know, was completely screwed over in the past, having forced to give up their nuclear weapons with the promise that they would be protected, and they should have never given up their nuclear weapons. And so, if Putin is completely irrational on that point, and that looks like the deciding factor to essentially get the suffering and the death and the destruction to end, then I would imagine that Trump will have some sort of like mutual defense, like security pact, if anything would happen in the future. But I just want to say, going back to another point about Europe, like. Of course, Europe has given money to Ukraine, but the absolute gall of them to condemn Trump for threatening to withhold aid to Zelensky and any sort of his tough guy posturing towards Zelensky, when Europe has literally spent more money on buying gas from Putin since the beginning of the war than they have on loans to Ukraine. They do not have the military means, nor can they afford to provide Ukraine with what it needs to defeat Russia. And the reason why they gave such little money is because they were relying on Biden, who was throwing them $175 billion, half of which Zelensky said his country hadn't even received. So God knows where that's going. So I think it's also important here when we say like Europe, we need to distinguish between like Western Europe and Poland and Denmark and Finland. Obviously, these were not really the countries that I was referring to when I was talking about Europe. I actually believe that these countries, have they've actually sacrificed a lot to come to Ukraine's aid, much more than the Western Europeans have, despite the Western European virtue signaling and their declarations of support for Ukraine and condemnations of Trump. So that's really who I was referring to. But if we want to talk about Eastern Europe, then that would be a separate conversation.
Yes, and defence spending as a whole for European nations, a key topic of contention, and one that has been discussed with US involvement as well. Walter, I will come to you, and I want to take a brief step away from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because we've heard from Russia themselves that it's not just the Ukraine war that will be discussed. Also, conversations set to take place around the topic of nuclear weapons, a nuclear arsenal, and also a nuclear pact or threat that might be there. How significant is this in the face of Trump's recent move to nuclear submarines?
Yeah, people I've talked to here in Washington note that, there could be the nuclear question come up. My guess is not at this meeting. That's a very complicated issue. More likely is the issue of economics and the various tariffs and sanctions. That is what Putin wants lifted. He wants the sanctions lifted because the Russian economy is not doing well, and that often doesn't get through. But my contacts tell me that at the World Bank told me that the Russian economy is not doing all that well. In fact, it's getting worse. And one of the things that bothers Putin is this tends to affect public opinion in Russia regarding what's happened. And so I think that's on his mind. And look who went with him. A virtual plane load of businessmen went with Putin to Alaska. And why are they doing there? What are they doing there? They're there to try to work out economic deals and ways that the Russians can be a participant. I think this is uppermost in Putin's mind, because he knows this will affect public opinion at home, and it will affect the way the things that the Russia can do. The Russians have some problems, in fact, a lot of problems, because of the various sanctions that was placed on them and the cost of the Ukraine war, which is enormous, not only in terms of money, but in terms of people who are dying. Russian soldiers, North Korean soldiers who are participating with the Russians, many of them have died as well. And the Ukrainian soldiers. It's an awful situation. Now, you earlier asked someone, what's likely to come out? What are the two leaders want to come out? They want to come out looking good in both cases. Now, what does it mean to look good? I think for the sake of Trump, and he's tried to sort of play down the prospects of any grand deal coming out, is something that indicates the Russians are considering a ceasefire and they can move in that direction, and then calling a meeting which has Zelensky very quickly, and maybe some of the Europeans as well. I think that's going to happen next. And my own personal opinion, what I hear, is that could happen in just a matter of days, if not a few weeks. And I think that's what he wants. And I think, both will come out looking good if it shows that they're both negotiating and achieving something that keeps these things alive. I don't think at this meeting you're going to have anything grand other than that. We'll know with the questions and answers a better, indication of that. But that's not my opinion. I just got finished with another program, TV program in another country, in which that was the sense that you're really going to have to listen to what they say at the Q's and A's as to where we go from here.
Yes.
Because I personally think that the two leaders will probably try to make themselves look good and think, and I'm sure Putin has been advised by his people, here's what you have to say, polite language, nice things to say, to give an indication. And partly it's his long thing of dragging out these talks. And Trump, I think, needs to know. All you have to do is look at the American press today, to see what the sort of things that I think Trump has to respond to. And he's being advised as to how to do it. But I don't think you're going to have any grand bargains. And I think it will actually achieve a lot if they indicate they're going to move to a next set of meetings, which involves Zelensky and maybe some of the Europeans. I think you ought to have another. That's going to be fascinating. And the Q's and A's tonight after the meeting, and I'm told that this meeting could go for 5 or 6 hours, is going to be fascinating because it's going to give some indication of the likelihood of having a next set of meetings. And so far, what I was told is Trump hasn't walked out. Remember, he said in the first few minutes of a meeting with Putin, if he doesn't think he's moving in a favorable direction, he'll walk out. Well, the meeting's been going on, an hour now, hour and a half. He hasn't walked out yet. So my guess is they'll come up with something because they both want to look good on the world stage.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you ever so much for your insights. I also want to thank Karis, David and Adrian for their time and insights. Of course, so much to discuss, and we wait to hear how these meetings have been going between Trump, Putin and their top teams. Make sure to stay tuned here on NewsX World for all of the latest.